The universe's deadliest hunters. Broken by human hands, the transmission came in at ZO314 standard cycle, and I was already awake. I had not slept properly in 6 days. That was not unusual for me. I am Jarek, Senior Intelligence Analyst for the Krath Dominion, and in 41 years of service I have learned that the galaxy does not pause for rest cycles. It simply keeps producing problems, and someone has to be awake to document them. That night, the problem was a blue and white planet sitting quietly at the edge of the outer expansion zone, third from a yellow sun, surrounded by nothing remarkable except a single large moon and an atmosphere so thick with oxygen that our early scouts had flagged it as biologically hostile to prolonged Krath exposure. The planet had a name now. The creatures living on it had given it one. They called it Earth. I had been studying the initial intelligence reports on these creatures for nearly 3 months, and everything about them defied easy categorization. They were bipedal. They stood upright on 2 limbs and used 2 more for tool manipulation. They had no natural armor, no venom glands, no claws worth noting, and their skin was so soft that even mild temperature changes could damage it. Their eyes faced forward, which our biologists noted was a predator trait, but their body structure communicated something else entirely. They were slow compared to nearly every large creature they shared a planet with. They could not outrun a planestalker. They could not outswim the deep ocean creatures of their own world. They could not fly at all without machines they had built themselves. On paper, they were nothing. I had flagged that assessment as dangerously incomplete 3 separate times. The first flag came after I reviewed their geological record and matched it against their cultural archive. This species had been in continuous, uninterrupted conflict with itself for the entirety of its recorded history. Not occasional conflict. Not border skirmishes or resource disputes that burned bright and ended in a generation. And continuous, organized, escalating. Every time they developed a new tool, they immediately found a way to use it to hurt each other more efficiently. Every time a conflict ended, they spent the peace period studying what went wrong and preparing for the next one. Their entire cultural development, from the earliest stone carvings to the digital data packets our scouts intercepted, was threaded through with warfare the way a river is threaded through stone. It did not interrupt their civilization. It was part of its structure, as fundamental and load-bearing as any other element of how they organized themselves. I spent 2 weeks going through the military history files our long-range observation drones had collected. I read about their ancient land wars, their sea battles, their first aerial engagements, their development of weapons capable of ending their civilization entirely, which they built and then chose not to use in full. Which might actually have been the most alarming data point of all. The self-restraint required to build something catastrophic and then hold it in reserve, using it only as a deterrent, suggested a level of long-term strategic thinking that our Conquest database had no comparable entry for. The second flag came when I analyzed their biological stress response. Every species I had ever studied showed measurable cognitive degradation under high-threat conditions. This is logical. When the body believes it is about to end, it routes resources away from complex thinking and toward immediate physical response. Fight or run. Simple, efficient, evolutionarily sensible. Humans did something different. Under extreme stress, under direct physical threat, their cognitive function did not degrade. In some documented cases, across multiple independent medical studies their own scientists had conducted, it actually improved. There were records in their own archives of individuals in life-threatening situations, solving complex mechanical problems, making precise calculations under severe pressure, and communicating clearly and effectively, all while experiencing injuries that would have rendered a Krath soldier non-functional. Their own scientists had a term for this. They called it performing under pressure. They studied it. They trained for it deliberately and systematically. They wrote entire libraries of books about how to do it better. They ran their military candidates through deliberate simulations of extreme stress to identify who performed well and develop that performance into a consistent skill. I read those books, all of them that our drones had captured. It took me 11 days. What I found was not a species that coped with pressure despite their biological limitations. It was a species that had metabolized pressure into a functional advantage. The same neurological architecture that made other species shut down under threat made humans sharpen. It was not universal. Not every human performed this way. But their military selection systems were specifically and deliberately designed to find the ones who did, and their training systems were designed to develop that trait to its maximum potential. I noted in my second flag that this had significant implications for any prolonged engagement. An enemy that gets functionally better the harder you push them is not an enemy. You can simply overwhelm with force. Increasing the force increases their performance. I flagged this specifically and asked for a behavioral science review before any contact operations were considered. The behavioral science review was not conducted. The third flag came after I cross-referenced their military archive with our own historical conquest data. The Kreth Dominion had been at war, in one form or another, for 3,000 years. We had fought 47 different species. Our longest single conflict had lasted 11 months before the opposing civilization either surrendered or collapsed entirely under the pressure of sustained engagement. 11 months was considered, within Dominion's strategic doctrine, an unacceptably prolonged campaign. Resources drain. Morale erodes. The psychological cost of sustained conflict becomes untenable for any organism with a functional survival instinct. Every species we had ever fought understood this, even if they could not articulate it as strategy. They all had a breaking point, a moment when continued resistance cost more than submission, and they all eventually reached it. Humans had a word for that moment too. They called it a turning point. To them, it was not the end of resistance, it was the beginning of the next phase. Their longest recorded single conflict had lasted 116 years. 116 years, between two groups of the same species, without stopping, without a final collapse of will on either side. Simply a prolonged and brutal engagement that eventually produced a negotiated end through mutual exhaustion, and which both participants immediately began studying, so they could fight better the next time. I submitted my third flag with a full 40-page supplementary report recommending that the Dominion delay all first contact operations against the planet Earth until a more comprehensive behavioral analysis could be completed. I requested a minimum of 2 additional years of observation. I included a summary table comparing human military persistence metrics against every other species in our conquest database. The column representing humans sat so far outside the distribution of every other data point that I had to redesign the chart 3 times before it would fit on a standard display without the human column running off the edge. Fleet Commander Vex Thak reviewed my report in what I am told was approximately 4 minutes. His response was a single line. The analyst's concerns are noted and rejected. Species is prey grade. First wave launches at next favorable transit window. I read that response and felt something I had not felt in a long time. I felt afraid. Not of the humans specifically, not yet, though that would come later in full measure. I was afraid because I recognized the shape of what was happening. I had seen it before, in older institutional records, in the histories of species the Dominion had consumed. There was always a moment, documented in hindsight with painful and precise clarity, where someone with information tried to give it to someone with authority, and the authority decided the information was inconvenient. The Dominion had produced that moment for other civilizations many times. Now, sitting in my observation post with my 40-page report filed and ignored, and the first wave fleet pre-launching coordinates already filed and locked, I had a very clear and very uncomfortable sense that we were about to become the example in someone else's cautionary history. The first wave consisted of 43 warships. By Krath standards, it was a moderate force, precisely appropriate for a species with no faster-than-light capability and no documented interstellar weapons development. The fleet's operational mandate was standard and had been executed the same way across 4 decades of expansion. Enter the system, establish orbital dominance, broadcast subjugation terms in the species' primary communication format, and await compliance. If compliance was not achieved within 1 standard cycle, begin targeted surface pressure operations to accelerate the process toward the desired outcome. I watched the fleet enter the Sol system from my monitoring post aboard the Dominion relay station, 40 light minutes from Earth. I had a direct sensor feed. I had a cup of cold liquid nutrients sitting untouched beside my console. I had my 40-page report open in a secondary window, not because I expected to be asked to reference it, but because I wanted the numbers in front of me while I watched. I wanted to see the moment the data was either proved wrong or proved right. I wanted very badly to be proved wrong. Being proved right was going to be enormously expensive. At 0847, the first wave crossed the heliopause and began its approach vector toward the 3rd planet. Standard formation, perfect discipline. Vex Thak was many things, and one of them was a genuinely excellent formation commander. His ships moved in the kind of synchronization that takes years of drilling to achieve. I had always respected that about him, even in the many moments when I disagreed with his judgment on other matters. At 0849, the Human Defense Network went active. I did not know, in that moment that they had one. Our scouts had detected industrial facilities over the preceding decade, orbital platforms, and a handful of launch signatures consistent with early-stage space exploration activity. We had categorized those platforms as communication and observation infrastructure. We had been systematically wrong. What our scouts had logged as communication arrays were targeting systems of considerable sophistication. What we had recorded as fuel storage facilities on orbital platforms were weapons magazines. The humans had been building in plain sight, and we had looked at everything they constructed and seen exactly what they had chosen for us to see. At 0851, 2 minutes after the Human Defense Network activated, the first Krath warship went silent. I stared at my sensor feed. I checked the connection. I ran a full diagnostic on the feed system. The ship was simply gone from the data, not destroyed in any way our weapons recognition software could classify with a known profile, just no longer present in the sensor returns. Then a second ship disappeared. Then, in a span of 11 seconds, 4 more. Vexthok's command ship began evasive maneuvers. The remaining 37 ships shifted formation, which was the tactically correct response to an ambush, and I found myself leaning forward in my chair, watching the feed, trying to understand what I was seeing in the sensor returns because none of it matched any weapon signature in our combat database. The humans were not using one type of weapon system, they were using 17, I counted them. Later, in the reconstruction analysis, I went through the sensor logs frame by frame over a period of 3 days, and I counted 17 distinct weapon signatures in the first 4 minutes of engagement alone. Some were kinetic, some were directed energy, some were things I had no existing classification categories for and had to create new ones in my field database. They had not developed one answer to Krath warship shielding. They had developed 17 answers and were cycling through them in real time, apparently testing which specific profiles worked most effectively against our specific shield configurations in the middle of a live engagement, while simultaneously coordinating fleet movements across a 3-dimensional combat space spanning nearly 1 million kilometers of open space. At 0904, 17 minutes after the first ship went silent, Vexthok's command ship entered emergency retreat protocol. I do not use the word retreat lightly. In 4 decades of Krath military records, I could count on 2 limbs the number of times a first-wave fleet had issued an emergency retreat signal. It was a designation reserved for encounters with genuinely superior force, and even then it was considered a profound institutional failure, the kind of event that ended careers and was written about in cautionary doctrines for the next generation of commanders as an example of what never to repeat. At 0906, Vexthok's ship stopped transmitting entirely. I sat in my chair and looked at the sensor feed for a long time without moving. 43 ships had entered the Sol system. 6 came out. 5 of those 6 were heavily damaged. The 6th was an escape pod, single occupancy, tumbling on a ballistic trajectory that would bring it close enough to the relay station for retrieval in approximately 9 hours. The escape pod's occupant identification beacon was transmitting a command-level authorization code. It was Vexthok. I flagged the pod for retrieval, rerouted 2 drones to intercept trajectory, and then I sat back in my chair and opened a new document in my field analysis system. I stared at the blank input field for a full minute, then I began to write. The first line read, "Initial engagement with Sol 3 inhabitants has concluded. Assessment. Recommendation for immediate withdrawal from contested space is now upgraded from advisory status to critical priority. Full analysis follows." I wrote for 6 hours without stopping or leaving my console. At the end of it, I had a document that was longer than anything I had produced in my entire career. It was thorough. It was honest. It drew on every piece of data I had spent 3 months collecting, and every behavioral analysis I had written, and every flag I had filed, and every warning that had been set aside. It was, I believed without exaggeration, the most important intelligence report the Dominion had received in at least a century. I sent it through the priority channel and settled in to wait. 9 hours later, the retrieval drones brought Vexthok's escape pod aboard. Medical personnel met it at the docking port. I was standing in the corridor outside, waiting. I had been waiting since the moment the drones picked up the pod's transponder signal. When the retrieval team opened the pod, the fleet commander was conscious. He had a significant injury to his left side, deep bruising across most of his dorsal plating, and the particular look in his eyes that I had seen only a handful of times in my career. Always in soldiers who had survived something they had genuinely not believed they would survive. He looked at me. He had known I would be there. Someone had told him, or he had simply predicted it, which in retrospect would not have surprised me. I did not say anything. I did not reference the report. I made no gesture that could be interpreted as satisfaction at being correct, because I was not satisfied. I was profoundly and thoroughly unsatisfied. In the specific way that you can only feel when the thing you predicted came true and you had spent months hoping with everything you had that your prediction was wrong. He held my gaze for a long moment while the medical team worked around him. Then he said in a voice that was very quiet and very controlled 7 words. He said they were smiling when they engaged us. I did not ask him to clarify. I wrote it down. They were smiling. I thought about that statement for many hours after the medical team moved him down. The corridor and I returned to my console. I had read extensively about human facial expressions during my research period. I understood the basic mechanics. I knew that the expression he was describing, the upward curve at the corners of the mouth, could indicate pleasure, amusement, relief, or satisfaction at a task completed successfully. It could also, in specific contexts their own psychologists documented, indicate a state of high focus and controlled intensity, the outward expression of a mind operating at its fullest capacity, and finding experience of that operation rewarding. I thought about the sensor logs. I thought about 17 weapon signatures cycling in the first 4 minutes. I thought about targeting systems hidden inside communication arrays for an unknown number of years. I thought about Eleanor Voss and her 15 years of preparatory notes, which I had not yet found but would find in 3 days, when I started pulling the captured intelligence files more carefully. I thought about what it meant to smile while you were doing all of that. I opened Vexthak's retrieval record and added 1 line to my field notes. Recommend immediate psychological review of all surviving engagement personnel. Secondary recommendation: do not interpret their composure during the engagement as confidence. It was readiness, and those are not the same thing. Then I sent a formal request to the Dominion High Council, bypassing the command chain entirely, flagging it as an emergency advisory requiring review before any second wave authorization was considered. The request was acknowledged within the hour. A response was promised within 3 standard cycles. I went back to my console and pulled up the sensor logs from the engagement. I started them from the beginning. I was going to watch every second of those 17 minutes until I understood exactly what had happened, because understanding was the only reliable defense against making the same mistake twice, and the Dominion could not afford to make the same mistake twice. 43 ships had gone in, 6 had come out. 17 minutes. I pressed play. When the emergency strategic review convened, I was given exactly 9 minutes to present my findings before a room that had already decided the outcome. I had prepared for this situation specifically. In 41 years of service, I had developed a detailed internal map of when I was being heard and when I was being listened to. Being heard means the words enter someone's perceptual system and are processed into recognizable language. Being listened to means the meaning of those words reaches the decision-making structures of the mind and is genuinely considered. The 9 generals, 4 admirals, and 2 High Council observers arranged around that chamber table were hearing me without exception. Not one of them was listening in the second sense. I presented the sensor reconstruction regardless. I put every number on the display screen. I walked through the 17 weapons signatures in sequence, explaining each one, what it indicated about human technical capability, what it indicated about their preparation timeline, and what the cycling's behavior during the engagement implied about their real-time adaptive capacity. I explained what the distributed command structure meant for any future engagement. I explained, in the clearest and most precise language I knew how to use, what the full engagement data showed when read without the assumption that these were a prey-grade species performing beyond expectations. They were not performing beyond expectations. They were performing exactly at the level their own military doctrine and 15 years of documented preparation would predict. We had simply not read the documents until after the engagement. I had 6 minutes remaining on my presentation window when Fleet Admiral Darhan interrupted me. He spoke in the particular tone that senior officers use when they wish to convey patience while actually communicating that the patience is wearing thin. He asked whether I was suggesting that a species with no faster-than-light travel and a civilization less than 10,000 years old represented a genuine strategic threat to a dominion that had expanded successfully for 3 millennia. Yes, I said, specifically because of those factors. A species that developed these defense capabilities without faster-than-light technology, working entirely with resources they could build and observe within their own star system, with a civilization younger than several of our most established colony stations, represents a threat, precisely because we do not have an explanation for how they built what we have observed. Unknown capability is always more operationally dangerous than known capability, Admiral, because you cannot plan around variables you have not measured. There was a pause in the room. Not a comfortable one. High Council Observer Ven Sarek said that my report spent considerable space on psychological and behavioral analysis that read more like philosophical speculation than intelligence work. Persistence, she said, adaptability, emotional response under stress conditions. These were soft descriptors, she said. What she needed were hard numbers. I told her that the hard numbers were in Appendix 3, cross-referenced with comparable species data, and that the behavioral analysis in the main text existed to explain why those numbers looked the way they did, because without context the numbers were simply anomalous, and anomalous data without interpretation is just a warning that has not been decoded yet. She did not look at Appendix 3. Darhan announced that the Dominion would authorize a second wave, 3 times the complement of the first wave, with full suppression doctrine parameters. The primary adjustment to doctrine would be additional intelligence on fixed defensive positions before the engagement envelope opened. We would not repeat the error of underestimating their orbital infrastructure. I had 3 minutes remaining in my presentation window. I told him, as directly as I could without making it an accusation, that the error was not underestimating the fixed defensive positions. The error was assuming that what we could observe from outside represented the full extent of what they had built. I strongly recommended that before authorizing a second wave we consider the probability, based on the engagement data, that what we had seen in the first wave engagement was similarly incomplete, that they had shown us what they needed to show us to win that specific engagement, and had not yet revealed anything beyond that threshold. Noted, said Darhan. Meeting adjourned. I walked back to my station and began preparing for the second wave analysis. I did not waste time on anger. Anger is a resource with a limited reserve, and I needed everything I had for the work ahead. The second wave launched 11 days later. I submitted a request to transmit a precautionary advisory to the fleet before departure and was told, by an adjutant rather than by anyone with actual command authority, that my advisory would undermine operational confidence among the personnel. I wrote it anyway and filed it under a classified archive reference where it would be preserved intact and completely inaccessible to anyone with the authority to act on it. Sometimes the only thing an analyst can do is make sure the record is clear. The fleet was 63 warships. Full suppression complement, every class represented. Vexthak had been medically retired from active command, his career ending not with formal ceremony but with a quiet administrative reclassification to advisory consultancy role that involved no operational authority and no decisions that affected anything. His replacement was Fleet Admiral Sareth Cole, a younger commander with a genuinely impressive record against the Veltar Confederation and the Dramosi Collective, 2 species that had been widely considered difficult opponents before the first wave had set a new standard for what difficult actually meant. Sareth Cole had not read my reports. I know this because I asked his adjutant directly. The adjutant told me the Admiral found extensive psychological behavioral analysis outside his operational planning requirements. I noted this in my file and said nothing further. I watched the second wave enter the Sol system from the same relay station. I had not returned to Dominion Core territory in 23 days. What happened in the 4 hours following the fleet's entry into the Sol system was not a battle in any sense I had a trained vocabulary to describe precisely. The first wave engagement had been an ambush, recognizable, reconstructible, something you could break into phases and label with tactical terminology and trace cause and effect through with reasonable confidence. The second wave engagement was something the terminology did not cover. The humans had studied the first wave engagement themselves. I know this because the behavior of their forces in the second wave engagement reflected specific adaptations to first wave data points that could only have come from a detailed post-engagement analysis of their own. Where the first wave had encountered fixed defensive positions, the second wave encountered something else entirely. A mobile network of smaller craft that did not hold formation and did not appear to require it. They operated in loose clusters across a vast engagement space, each cluster making decisions independently and at speed, without waiting for coordination from any central command node, yet somehow maintaining a coherent overall strategy that pressed the Krath formation from multiple directions simultaneously, adapting to Krath countermoves in intervals so short they were measurable in seconds. I pulled the engagement logs within hours of the fleet's return and began the reconstruction immediately. It took me 3 days of continuous analysis to understand the basic mechanism of what I was looking at. They had distributed their command structure, deliberately and comprehensively. Each cluster had its own commander with full tactical authority, within a set of shared strategic objectives. The clusters communicated with each other, but did not depend on each other. Removing any single command node did not degrade the overall performance of the formation, because the remaining nodes did not need the removed one to function. In Krath doctrine, identifying and neutralizing the command structure was the primary strategic priority in any engagement, because it worked. Every species we had fought was hierarchically organized in ways that made decapitation effective. Against this human formation, there was no single command hierarchy to decapitate. There were dozens of independent nodes, each capable of continuing and adapting without the others. I found the records of the human officer who had designed this system. Her name was Eleanor Voss. She was 43 years old. Our intercepted human communication records showed a photograph, which in human cultural practice is a precise visual recording of a person's appearance. She had brown hair worn in a practical arrangement, pulled back and secured. She had what their records described as an average build, meaning she was neither particularly large nor small within the human range of physical variation. There was nothing about her external presentation that any Krath military assessment protocol would have categorized as remarkable. She had annotated battle plans and tactical development notes going back 15 years. I found them in the captured intelligence archive that the long-range observation drones had collected in the years before first contact. 15 years of systematic notes, scenarios, projections, contingency branches, counter-analyses of her own counter-analyses. She had written specifically about Krath fleet behavior, extrapolating our doctrine from our observable expansion patterns and the long-range sensor data her people had been collecting. She had tested counter-strategies in simulation, revised them, tested them again, built and discarded dozens of approaches until she had something that worked consistently across a wide range of scenario parameters. She had been developing this for 15 years. She had begun the work approximately 5 years before our first observation drones arrived in the Sol system. She had started preparing to fight us before she had proof we were coming, because, in her judgment, the observable expansion pattern of the Dominion made it a reasonable prediction that we would arrive eventually, and she had decided to be ready when we did. I added a new section to my ongoing analysis document and titled it, On Preparation as a Biological Trait. What I had understood about humans before the engagements was that they were physically vulnerable. Soft-skinned, slow, no natural armor, no venom, no features that any standard threat assessment would flag as inherently dangerous. This was factually accurate. It was also, I had come to understand through 3 months of intensive study and 2 engagements worth of hard evidence, entirely beside the point. A species that knows it is physically vulnerable has 2 choices available to it. It can accept that vulnerability and operate within the constraints it imposes, hoping that circumstances and fortune favor it often enough to survive. Or it can spend every available cognitive and material resource compensating for that vulnerability so thoroughly and over such a long period that the compensation itself becomes a core characteristic, indistinguishable from a natural trait. Humans had chosen the second path with such completeness and over such an enormous span of time that they did not even conceptualize it as compensation any longer. They called it readiness. They called it preparation. They called it by 100 different names in 100 different cultural traditions across their single small planet, but the underlying behavior was always the same. Identify what could go wrong, build against it now, before it goes wrong, in the background of everything else you are doing, without stopping. Their children's stories were full of this theme. I had read some of them, captured in the long-range drone archives, translated by our linguistic systems, the tales they told small children, before those children were old enough to understand strategy or conflict, were full of characters who failed because they did not prepare, and characters who succeeded because they did. They were encoding this principle at the foundational level of cognitive development. They were building it into the next generation, before the next generation could walk steadily. The second wave lost 41 of its 63 ships. Sareth Cole survived, and he extracted the remainder of his fleet in better order than Vex Thok had managed, which I noted in my after-action analysis, because professional accuracy requires credit where it is due, even when the overall picture is catastrophic. He had shown genuine tactical flexibility under extreme pressure, which was more than could be said for his predecessor. He requested a direct meeting with me the following morning. I met him in a briefing room with a view of open space. He was a tall individual by Krath standards, with the pale coloration typical of high-altitude breeding stock, and the quality of controlled stillness that experienced soldiers develop. The ability to be physically motionless while remaining completely attentive to everything in the room. He looked at me across the table and said nothing for almost a full minute. I let the silence run. I had learned over 4 decades of working with military commanders that filling silence prematurely was usually a mistake. He said, "Tell me exactly what they did." I told him everything. I did not simplify any part of it. I did not soften the implications. I walked through the engagement frame by frame, explained the distributed command architecture, walked through the adaptive weapons behavior, and what it indicated about their real-time decision capacity, explained how the pre-prepared targeting data from the first wave debris had clearly been incorporated into the second wave engagement plan, and described in detail what the independent cluster behavior meant for any tactical approach that relied on identifying and neutralizing a central command node. I talked for 90 minutes. Sareth Call did not interrupt once. He did not take notes. He watched me the entire time with the same attentive stillness. When I finished, he asked one question: "Can we defeat it?" "Not with current doctrine," I said. "Our fleet engagement systems are designed to function against hierarchically organized opponents. We find the structure, apply force to its most critical nodes, and the opponent collapses from the disruption of coordination. That model does not work here because the command structure is distributed, and each node is redundant to the others. Applying force to any one node does not disrupt the whole. So we need new doctrine," he said. "We need to understand the opponent before we write new doctrine," I said. "Otherwise we produce doctrine against what we predict they will do, rather than against what they are actually capable of doing. Those are very different targets." He looked at me steadily for a moment. Then he said he would submit a request to the High Council for a 6-month strategic pause before any third wave authorization was considered. I had not expected that. Coming from a combat admiral who had just lost 41 ships, requesting a pause rather than a revenge sortie was an act of strategic self-awareness that was professionally notable. I told him so, briefly. He said, "Do not thank me yet. I need something I can actually use." I went back to my station. The surviving fleet personnel had been processed through medical and debrief. I requested access to all the debrief transcripts. 7 of them, from 7 different soldiers who had never spoken to each other after the engagement, contained the same phrase. They used slightly different words because they were different individuals, and because the debrief prompts were open-ended rather than structured. But the core of what they said was identical. They said the humans did not stop. Not that they were well coordinated, not that their weapons were powerful, not that their tactics were effective. 7 independent witnesses, describing the experience of a live engagement with a human military force, converged independently on the same fundamental description: they don't stop. I wrote that at the top of a new analysis page. Then I put aside everything I thought I already knew and started reading everything I could find about why that was true. The 60-day pause lasted 31 days. I had been awake for most of them, not because my rest cycle was compromised, but because for the first time in my career I was engaged in an analysis problem that felt genuinely urgent at every hour. Every document I pulled from the captured intelligence archive led me to 2 more that I had not previously flagged. The archive was vast. 10 years of long-range drone observation had produced an enormous volume of intercepted human communications, cultural media, academic publications, governmental records, and military documentation. The drones had been thorough. The problem was that I had initially prioritized technical and military data, which was standard procedure, and had not allocated sufficient attention to the cultural and psychological materials, because standard procedure had not previously identified psychology as a primary strategic variable. Standard procedure had been wrong. I was making up for it now. I read their history of medicine, their history of exploration, their history of philosophy. I read the records of their various governmental structures across different regions of their planet and different time periods, looking for the threads of consistency that ran through all the variation. What I found over and over was a species that responded to apparent limitation not by accepting the limitation, but by treating it as a problem that required a technical or organizational solution. Every time their environment threatened them, they built something to manage the threat. Every time their bodies proved inadequate for a task, they built a tool that extended their body's capability. Every time an opponent proved stronger, they studied the opponent until they found a weakness. Then they exploited that weakness with focused and sustained effort until the outcome changed. There was a human thinker, from several centuries in their past, whose work appeared in multiple translated forms across the archive. He had written extensively about the nature of human will and what he called the drive toward meaning. I read his complete works in translation and found one particular passage that I returned to many times in the following days. He wrote that everything can be taken from a person except the freedom to choose one's response to any given circumstance. He wrote this from personal experience, having survived conditions that should by any standard physical and psychological measure have destroyed him. He did not simply survive them. He studied them. He thought about them carefully and built a systematic understanding of human resilience from within, the experience of being tested to his absolute limit. He was not a military figure. He was a psychologist. But his work was referenced in human military training curricula across multiple national defense organizations on their planet. They taught his ideas to their soldiers because the ideas were operationally useful. The idea that the response to any circumstance is always a choice, even when every other variable is outside your control, is not simply a philosophical comfort. In a combat context, it means that a soldier who has internalized this idea will continue to function and adapt and make decisions even when everything in the engagement is going wrong, because they have trained their mind to keep choosing their response rather than simply reacting to circumstance. I was still reading when the second human transmission arrived. It came in at 0219 standard cycle on the 31st day of the pause. It was addressed to the Krath Dominion High Council through formal diplomatic channels, which were not channels that formally existed between our civilizations, but which the humans had apparently decided to use anyway because they needed a formal channel, and they were not going to wait for one to be officially established before sending what they needed to send. It was also addressed, in a separate header line, to Senior Intelligence Analyst Jarek. I sat in my chair for a full minute before I opened the message. It was from Eleanor Voss. It was not long. It was written with the same quality of precision I had come to associate with her. From the years of battle plans and tactical notes I had spent the last 3 weeks reading, every sentence was doing exactly the work it needed to do and nothing extra. She wrote that the Human Defense Forces had been monitoring Dominion communications for approximately 8 years. She noted that they had read my advisory reports, including the ones marked classified. She noted specifically that they were aware my recommendations had been overruled. She wrote that she found this information significant in a way she would explain further, in person, if a meeting could be arranged. Then she wrote the line I read 4 times before I trusted my translation software. She wrote that they did not want this conflict to continue any more than I apparently did. She wrote that she understood the Dominion conquest civilization, and that conquest civilizations did not stop until they had a sufficient reason to believe that stopping was more strategically sound than continuing. She wanted to give the Dominion that reason, not through further demonstration of military force, because more demonstration was a less efficient path to the outcome she preferred, but through information. Transparent, complete, and honest information about what the Dominion was actually dealing with, so that its leadership could make an informed strategic decision rather than an emotional one. Attached to the message were 412 documents. I did not leave my station for 3 days. The document package was comprehensive in a way that I had not anticipated, and that I found, on reflection, both generous and extraordinarily calculated. It was generous because sharing this much information about your own military capability and psychological infrastructure with a potential adversary carries real risk. It was calculated because the risk was acceptable when weighed against the alternative, a third wave that would force another demonstration engagement, producing more loss on both sides, and still not necessarily producing the strategic recalibration in Dominion leadership that was the actual desired outcome. They had decided that transparency was more efficient than force. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about all the species in the Dominion Conquest Archive that had tried transparency, had tried communication, had tried explaining themselves and appealing to reason. None of them had done it from this position. None of them had beaten back 2 waves and then chosen to send a document package. They had sent pleas. They had offered tribute. They had proposed surrender terms. Voss had not done any of those things. She had sent an intelligence briefing because she was an intelligence professional, and she understood that informed decision-makers make better decisions than uninformed ones, and she wanted the Dominion to make a specific decision, and she was giving us everything we needed to reach it on our own. The audacity of it had a quality I could only describe, in the Krath language, as a kind of aggressive patience. The patience of someone who knew they had already won, and was simply managing the pace at which the other side came. To understand it, I compiled her documents with my own analysis framing them, wrote the clearest introduction of my career, explaining precisely what the High Council was reading and why every page of it mattered, and sent the complete package through emergency priority routing. The High Council convened within 4 hours. I was summoned to present. The chamber was full in a way I had not seen before. Every senior military figure, both council observers, and High Matriarch Javal herself. The High Matriarch was old by Krath standards and very still in the way that certain kinds of authority express themselves, not through motion or display, but through a quality of concentrated attention that made everything she looked at feel like it was being weighed, carefully and honestly. She looked at me that way when I entered the room. She told me she had read the complete document package and my analysis. She said this at the opening of the session, before Darhan could set the agenda, which told me something about her purpose in being there. She asked me to explain, in plain language, what I believed the documents showed and what I believed the humans wanted. I stood in front of the most powerful figure in the Dominion and I told the truth as precisely and completely as I could. I told her that the documents showed a species that had been aware of the Dominion's approach for at least a decade and had spent that time preparing, specifically and technically, for the engagement that had now occurred twice. I told her that the document package was not a peace offering. It was a briefing. It was Voss telling us that we were not at the top of the information hierarchy in this conflict, and that the information gap was growing, not shrinking, the longer we continued on the current path. I told her that the human psychological profile made prolonged conflict a structurally disadvantaged position for the Dominion, not because our technology was inferior, though in specific critical areas it now was, but because the combination of adaptive capacity, persistence, and the specific neurological profile for performing well under sustained pressure meant that time in this conflict favored the humans. The longer a conflict continued, the more data they collected and incorporated, the more capable they became. Time was not a neutral variable here. Time was working for them and against us. I told her that the humans had not used the full extent of their capability in either engagement. They had deployed exactly sufficient force to win and had held everything beyond that threshold in reserve. I had no clear picture of where that upper boundary was. That was, I believed, entirely intentional on their part. I told her that Eleanor Voss had sent a diplomatic channel as an alternative to demonstrating that upper boundary through a third engagement, and that this restraint was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign of strategic preference for a cleaner and less costly path to the outcome she wanted. And the outcome she wanted, based on everything in the document package and the framing of the message itself, was simply that the Dominion stop. The High Matriarch was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Then she asked me one question. Can they reach our core systems currently? I told her no. Their faster-than-light capability was early stage. They could not currently project force to Dominion core worlds. But their technological development rate, extrapolated from what they had built in the 10 years they knew we were observing them, put that window at years rather than decades. She nodded once. She said, "Leave us." The room cleared. I moved toward the door with the others. She said my name. I stopped. When the room was empty, she asked me one more question. She asked whether, in 40 years of intelligence work, I had ever recommended withdrawal from a contested zone. No, I said. Do you recommend it now? She asked. What I recommend, I said carefully, is that we open a diplomatic channel before the third wave is authorized. I believe Eleanor Voss sent that message specifically to give us a reason to do exactly that. I believe she is waiting to hear from us, and I believe the window for that conversation is shorter than it appears. The High Matriarch looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "File the diplomatic request under my authorization and use the frequency in the attachment." I returned to my station and filed the request within 11 minutes of leaving the chamber. The human response arrived in 11 minutes after that. Prepared. Of course it was prepared. The response included a draft framework for preliminary discussions that was structured, precise, and bore every mark of having been written by someone who had been anticipating this moment for a considerable period. I attached it to my briefing document with a single annotation, noting that the framework had clearly been prepared before our response was received, and recommending specific attention to Section 4, which addressed mutual non-pursuit clauses. Section 4 had anticipated, specifically and without being asked, the concern that mattered most to the High Matriarch. It stated that neither party would pursue offensive operations into the other's established territorial space, as long as the agreement held. Clean and simple. Exactly the assurance the Dominion needed to see before it could seriously consider a negotiated end to the engagement. They had known we would need that assurance. They had written it in before we asked. The third wave was never authorized. There is a specific kind of quiet that settles over an institution after something it was absolutely certain of turns out not to be true. It is not the quiet of resolution or relief. It is the quiet of a very large and very old structure that is in the slow process of realizing it must now think about itself differently. The Krath Dominion had spent 3,000 years as the only apex predator in the space it knew. It had never encountered a species that stopped it. Not one. 47 civilizations had stood in its path and none of them had held. And now, in a conflict that had lasted less than 4 months from first wave to the signing of the Accord of Soul, a species the fleet commander had dismissed as prey grade had not simply held, but had done so in a way that made the Dominion genuinely uncertain about the upper boundary of what they were capable of. That uncertainty was, I think, the most significant change. The Dominion had faced difficult opponents before. Opponents who cost resources. Opponents who required tactical adjustment. But it had never faced an opponent that left it genuinely unsure of what the opponent was fully capable of, because the opponent had chosen not to show its full capability, because it had not needed to. That quality of strategic restraint, the capacity to hold back, to win cleanly without escalating, was something our behavioral models had no framework for because we had never needed. 1. Our models categorized opponents along axes of strength and weakness, capability and limitation. A model built entirely on those axes could not easily process an opponent that had made a deliberate and informed choice about which capabilities to reveal and when. I was formally reinstated to full analytical status on day 42 after the Accord. The notation in my personnel file read that previous advisory recommendations had been etched as operationally sound upon review. This is the institutional language for acknowledging correctness without using the words. I understood the convention and did not ask for plainer language. The reinstatement was sufficient. The investigation into my conduct had been quietly closed 21 days before the reinstatement. Darhain had retired for reasons of health, which is a different institutional language, for a different kind of acknowledgement. Ven Sarek had been reassigned to a role that involved less contact with active strategic planning. I was asked by the High Council office to write the official post-conflict analysis, the complete institutional account of the human engagement, the document that would define how the Dominion understood what had happened and would be used in military and strategic education for the next generation of Krath leadership. I accepted the commission without hesitation. It was work I was most qualified to do. It was also, I recognized clearly, work I was most afraid to do poorly. A post-conflict analysis is not simply a chronicle. It is an argument. It makes a specific claim about why events developed as they did, and that argument shapes how every future decision-maker in the institution thinks about similar situations going forward. If the argument contained the wrong lessons would be applied the next time those situations arose. I needed to get it right. And to get it right, I needed something no document in our archive could provide. I needed to talk to Eleanor Voss. I submitted a research access request through the diplomatic channel. I explained that I was writing the official Dominion account of the human engagement and that I wished to conduct a working research meeting with Human Defense Command personnel, specifically Voss, for the purpose of ensuring that the account was accurate and that my interpretation of the engagement data reflected the actual human intentions and decision-making processes rather than my inferences about them. I expected delays, bureaucratic friction, months of correspondence before anything was formally arranged. Diplomatic access requests between civilizations that had been at war 4 months earlier do not typically move quickly. The response arrived in 6 hours. Approved. Commander Voss would host the meeting personally. A date and transit window were attached. I boarded a diplomatic transport 12 days later and crossed the 40 light minutes to the Sol system for the first time in a capacity other than analyst at a remote monitoring station. The transit was uneventful. The arrival was not, from an internal perspective. The human orbital station was nothing like what I had constructed from the technical specifications in the intelligence archive. I had built my mental image of it from Krath engineering principles, which value compression and efficiency, and the elimination of any surface or space that does not serve a direct functional purpose. The human station was efficient. Certainly, every system I could identify was doing its job correctly, and the structural engineering was sound, but it was also full of things I could not immediately assign a function to in the standard sense. There were colors on the walls that served no informational or safety signaling purpose. There were plants growing in enclosed transparent containers in corridor sections. where plant life served no operational function I could identify. There were images everywhere, on display screens and on the walls themselves, that were not data readouts or navigational charts but representations of places and people, some of which I recognized from my research, and many of which I did not. Some of the images appeared to be artistic representations of those places and people, not precise recordings but interpretations, filtered through the visual sensibility of whoever had made them. A human technician who met me at the docking port walked me through the station, corridors toward the meeting location. She was young, with dark red hair and the kind of easy, comfortable movement in the station environment that indicated she had worked there a long time. She noticed me looking at an image on the corridor wall. It was a painting of mountains above a long valley, rendered in shades of deep blue and warm gold. She said it was called the Scottish Highlands, a region on the planet below, on what she called a clear day. She asked if I had seen mountain ranges before. I told her the Dominion had similar geological formations on several worlds. She asked if our people painted them. I thought about this for a genuine moment rather than giving the automatic answer. The Krath had visual art forms. They were representational and highly functional, used for recording historical events, communicating cultural and social status, and providing navigational and contextual information in built environments. We did not, to my knowledge, paint mountains for the experience of looking at a painting of mountains. I said we recorded them. She nodded as though that told her something she had not already known. She did not explain what she had taken from it. Eleanor Voss was waiting in the conference room. It had one large window that looked directly out at the planet below. I had seen Earth from sensor feeds for years. Seeing it in person was different in a way that I struggled to analyze cleanly. It was very large and very blue, and it moved visibly relative to the station. A slow and continuous rotation that gave the impression of something alive, in a scale that the word planetary does not quite capture in any language. I know. I stood at the window longer than I intended to. Voss let me stand there. She did not speak until I turned around. She was shorter than I had calculated from the data records, which I noted as a minor error in my physical estimation methodology. She had the same brown hair and the same practical arrangement. She shook my hand, which I had prepared for from the cultural briefings. I returned the gesture as well as the anatomical difference in our hands permitted. We sat down. She had arranged water and a small selection of human food items on the table. I declined the food with the formula I had prepared. She accepted this without comment or visible response of any kind. She said, "You wrote those early advisory reports, the classified ones recommending against engagement." "Yes," I said. She said, "We read them years before the first wave arrived. One of our communication intelligence teams had been running long-range intercept operations on Dominion transmissions for nearly a decade. When your flagged reports came through, the ones specifically arguing that we were more operationally dangerous than we appeared, there was a significant reaction across our defense planning community." I asked her what kind of reaction. She said mostly concern, some interest. A small number of people, she said, were genuinely flattered. I told her I had not intended the reports as compliments. She smiled. She said she was aware of that. I opened my research document and told her I wanted to ask something not covered in the materials she had sent. She said, "Go ahead." I told her that in the first wave engagement her forces had effectively ended the engagement with uncontested control of the engagement space. 6 ships were attempting retreat. Her forces had let them go. I asked why. She was quiet for a brief moment. Then she said there were 2 reasons. The first was practical. Survivors carry information. If no one had returned from the first wave engagement with an accurate report, the Dominion would have sent something substantially larger to find out what happened. If survivors returned and reported accurately, there was a real possibility, even a small one, that the institutional response would involve asking substantive questions before sending something larger. That outcome was worth preserving for. I said that was strategically sophisticated and asked about the second reason. She said, because they were retreating. Her forces had achieved their objective. They did not need to pursue ships that were leaving. Needing them to leave and needing to destroy every ship present were different objectives, and she had been precise about which objective she had actually been working toward. I wrote this down carefully. She said, "Most of the species in your conquest archive, by your own documentation, never reached a point where they had won an engagement with you. They never had to decide what to do after winning. We did, and we made a specific choice about what message we wanted the survivors to carry." I told her the message she had chosen to send was not a message of mercy. She said no. It was a message about what kind of opponent we are, an opponent that could have pursued and did not, because it chose not to, not because it lacked the capacity. That is a different message entirely. I said. You wanted us to understand the restraint was deliberate, she said. We wanted your leadership to know it had options. That is not mercy. That is strategy. We talked for 4 hours. She answered every question I had prepared and several I had not thought to prepare. She asked questions in return, specific and technical ones, about Krath cultural structures, the experience of surviving fleet personnel during the engagements, and the internal institutional response to the early advisory reports. She was, I recognized well into the second hour, conducting her own research meeting in parallel with mine. She was building a model of the Dominion's decision-making structures and cultural vulnerabilities, with the same systematic approach she had applied to everything else. We were both analysts working opposite sides of the same data set. Near the end of the 4 hours, she asked me, "Why did you keep filing those advisory reports?" The data showed the recommendations would be rejected and the investigation was already starting, informally by the third report. What were you working toward? I thought about the honest answer for a moment. I said, because the data was clear, and my function is to report what the data shows, regardless of whether that report is convenient for the people receiving. That is what an analyst is for. She said, we have a word for that. I asked what word. She said, integrity. It means that your actions match what you believe is right, even when circumstances make it easier to do otherwise. I wrote it down, not because I did not know the translation. I knew the translation. I wrote it down because I wanted it at the beginning of the section I was already forming in my mind, the section about what the human engagement had revealed about the relationship between individual functions and institutional outcomes, and what happens when an institution repeatedly ignores the former. When the meeting ended, we shook hands at the door of the conference room. She told me that the treaty carried my name on the acknowledgement page. She said her team had added it before sending the final draft for signature. I asked what I had done to warrant that. I had no formal role in the negotiations, she said. You are the reason there were negotiations. That seemed relevant enough to document. I had no prepared response. I stood in the corridor for a moment after she had gone back into the conference room. The painting of the Scottish Highlands was visible at the far end of the corridor. The mountains above the valley, blue and gold, rendered in paint by someone who had looked at a physical place and decided it was worth the effort of recreating it in another form just so other people could also see it. I thought about that for the entire transport home. I thought about a species that built defensive weapons and hid them in infrastructure arrays, and also painted mountains for the pleasure of seeing mountains painted. I thought about Eleanor Voss with 15 years of tactical notes, and the quiet practicality of someone who had spent her adult life thinking about this conflict and also the particular stillness she had shown when I stood at the window looking at the planet. She had let me look. She had known I needed to see it. I thought about the word integrity, and the word restraint and the word persistence and all the other words I had been collecting for months in the margins of my analysis document, the words that the Krath language had rough equivalents for, but not quite equivalents for, the words that meant something slightly different in a human context, because the human context was slightly different in a way I was still working to fully understand. I sat down when I reached my seat on the transport and I opened the analysis document and I deleted the introduction I had been writing for 3 months. I started again. The new opening read, "The human engagement cannot be accurately understood as a military event in isolation. It must be understood as an encounter with a fundamentally different relationship between physical vulnerability and strategic strength, between individual psychological traits and collective capability, between the experience of limitation and the response to that limitation over a very long period of time." This document attempts to explain how a species with no natural biological advantages produced the most strategically significant outcome in Dominion history, and what that outcome means for every strategic decision the Dominion makes going forward. I wrote for the entire transport journey. 2 rest cycles passed without my noticing. The document reached 312 pages before I was satisfied with it. The final section was the classified addendum, accessible only to the current and future High Matriarchs by personal authorization code. I had considered not including it. It was not, in the conventional sense, an analytical document. It did not derive its content from sensor data or behavioral modeling or comparative military history. It was a warning, plain and direct, written in the plainest language I knew. It read, "Do not pursue conflict with humanity again, not because achieving tactical victories is impossible. Under specific circumstances and with appropriate preparation it may be possible. The reason not to pursue conflict has nothing to do with tactical possibility. It is this: they will not stop. Not when they are losing. Not when the cost is severe. Not when the outcome is genuinely